Hey everyone! As we continue to go through our weird arcade ports that are on the Atari 2600, we are going to be moving into Galaxian. Galaxian was the first game in a series of space shooters, which is probably better known for Galaga than Galaxian or the third game, Galapus. It was also a Space Invaders clone. It was a really good Space Invaders clone, but it was a Space Invaders clone nonetheless. Galaxian was one of many, and I mean many, space shooters that used just a single screen. But what made it stand out from Space Invaders and a few of the other Space Invaders clones was that the sprites would actually move around and attack the player while they're on screen. It added some challenge to it, and it was pretty cool for the time. The second game, Galaga, which is probably the better game, upped the ante quite a bit by having the enemies actually flow into the screen and come into formation instead of already being on the screen in formation. It's a much better game, at least in my opinion, and it's the one that I prefer out of the entire series. Galapus was the third game in the series, and that's really all I can say about it. I didn't know it really existed. Anyway, let's get back to Galaxian. Galaxian is really just kind of your run-of-the-mill single-screen space shooter. It was developed and published by Namco in 1979. It was similar enough to Tato's Space Invaders, where people probably understood what they needed to do. After all, it is just basically a clone with a little bit of a twist to it. Which is kind of the thing, it was different enough to really still stand out from Space Invaders, what with the enemies actually breaking formation and dive bombing at your player. Galaxian was the first of many, and I mean many, arcade hits for Namco back in the late 70s and in the early 80s. Namco was able to sell about 40,000 arcade units, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But that was at the time when the arcades were really booming, both in Japan and in the United States, and honestly all over the world. Just like a lot of other games that we've talked about, Galaxian was ported to everything, home computers, and also the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 port was released in 1982. It also had an Atari 5200 port as well because, somebody had to make games for that thing. But where it gets really kind of crazy are the number of other things that Galaxian was ported to, and also the other games that got released under the Galaxian name. Like a few other arcade games at the time, Galaxian got one of the Coleco mini tabletop ports, which is kind of a cool collector's item. It's probably not the best way to play the game, but it is just kind of a nice thing to have on your shelf, and people will look at it and think it's kind of nice. I don't own one of those, but I have seen them before, and they are really well made. There also was a port or a clone, but I'm pretty sure it was a ripoff of Galaxian that was released on the Bally Astrocade. It actually had to be renamed to Galactic Invasion. I'm pretty sure because it wasn't really supposed to be a Galaxian game, and they just kind of used the name. And then there was a handheld game released by Entex, which was called Galaxian 2. Even though it wasn't a sequel to Galaxian, didn't have really anything to do with Galaxian, but I think it was just kind of a clone or ripoff that happened to be two-player, which is probably the only reason that it would be mentioned. Well, Galaga is probably a lot more challenging of a game just because they had a lot more time and they learned from Galaxian. I just kind of think this one's a pretty important game for arcade and video game history. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and have a great day, everyone.